NATO is actively preparing for a life without the United States, and this is why. Hi everyone, Neil Patterson here, host of This Is Why, and with all the speculation about where the world is currently heading, i.e. to hell in a handcart, today we thought we'd take a closer look at NATO, specifically what the organisation might look like in future. Because for all that we're told that we should take Donald Trump seriously, but not literally, he has been very clear, time and again, that the US might not be around for the long haul. So NATO is now actively planning for the day the Americans pick their ball up and head home. It's mostly been happening behind the scenes, certainly hasn't been widely reported, but it is happening. And NATO's 31 other members are actively planning ways of filling that big Trump-shaped hole, and that includes the UK. So what would NATO look like without the might of the US military? What can be done to reduce reliance on what is, by far, its biggest contributor? And shouldn't we have cracked on with this process a lot sooner? Professor Michael Clarke is Sky's defence and security analyst. Michael, I suppose we can start with a bit of an explainer, a reminder. What exactly NATO is and how it operates currently?
Yeah, well, it's the most impressive alliance the world has ever seen, bar none. It's existed since 1949. It works by consensus. It started off with 12 members. It's now got 32 members, which includes most of the European states, not all of them. And then in North America, of course, the United States, Canada, Iceland, really very important members. And there is a sort of political side and a military side. So the political side is the North Atlantic Council, which is all the defence chiefs sitting around, or it can be all the heads of state or heads of government sitting around it. So it's the political heads when they need to sit around. And then there's the military side, the military committee, which are the usually deputy service chiefs who are meeting fairly permanently. And as an organisation, it is it's both very impressive and very annoying because of course, it's full of holes and it's full of foolishness because you've got to find jobs for 32 different countries. They've got to be given a job in Brussels at the headquarters, and the headquarters is now very big. So it tends to get bureaucratised. But in reality, NATO has very few forces it can call upon. The Supreme Commander has a little group of defence forces, his own defence forces, to defend the organisation itself. Of a couple of thousand people. What he then does is he has to ask all of the members for their forces. The members pledge their forces to NATO, and then he has to say to them, right, we agree by consensus that our forces will do this, this and this.
One word that I've heard often talked about in relation to NATO is interoperability, the idea that our militaries can sync up. Just explain.
Yeah, I mean, what that means is that all of the members of NATO are on a hopefully a convergent path to use the same system. So, for instance, NATO artillery is standardised at 155 millimetre. So all the artillery shells are 155s.
Well, so something as simple as the size of the rounds that go in your guns.
Exactly. Was it the 7.62s, I think it is? Yeah. The NATO standard. And for instance, Russian artillery is mainly 152, which is why in Ukraine they had a lot of 152 artillery, but their new systems that they were getting from us needed 155s. So it's that sort of thing. And then more importantly than just the calibers you're dealing with is, buying equipment standardised, so more nations in NATO are buying F-35s as aircraft, so they're operating the same sort of aircraft. Lots of them operate F-16s, which are now being phased out. And then really importantly, and this is what there hasn't been enough of, is logistics. NATO actually having the ability to have common logistics. And in reality, the logistics issue is getting worse, not better, because, in 1949, Europe wasn't as urbanised as it is now. Now Europe is so much more urbanised, so there are more bridges, more issues, more rail tracks, and all of these things create logistical issues. If you're going to move troops around, let's say, 500,000 troops in an event of a war, you need to move from northern NATO to southern NATO. It's very difficult to work out how you're going to get them there in the modern European landscape.
Look, Michael, we have all spent decades assuming that the United States is the backbone, the linchpin of NATO. Call it what you will. How seriously is NATO taking the prospect of US withdrawal?
Last year, it didn't take it seriously enough. It thought it was a danger. This year, it is assuming it has, in a sense, happened. Right. Because whereas Donald Trump, he cannot withdraw the United States from NATO constitutionally, because NATO is governed by the Washington Treaty of 1949. And in 2023, a congressional bill was introduced, co-sponsored by Marco Rubio, which meant that only a two-thirds Senate majority could renounce the 1949 treaty, and that won't happen. A two-thirds Senate majority to get out of NATO won't happen. So Donald Trump cannot realistically take America out of NATO constitutionally, but politically he already has. Because politically, he's made it pretty clear that American troops aren't going to be helping the Europeans if they get into a fight with Russia, which is looking increasingly likely. They won't do it. Unless the Russians were stupid enough to attack American troops in Europe directly, then American troops, it is generally assumed, will be staying on their bases.
So if we imagine Donald Trump going kind of a step further than he has already, being inside the club but, not paying his dues, goes further than that and withdraws, what does NATO look like? What does it lose as a result of the departure of the Americans?
It doesn't lose numbers in the sense that it doesn't lose numbers of troops, and it doesn't lose huge numbers of aircraft and ships. It's pretty good on those things. On paper, it's pretty good. But what it cannot replace is America's backup. So it's America's logistics, America's intelligence, its satellite intelligence, all of which, at the moment, NATO is totally dependent on American satellite intelligence.
Do we not have our own satellite
Only just beginning to launch them.
Right.
We don't have a network of them. The Europeans, don't really have a network that they can rely on. And it's American, engineering, transport, strategic and tactical air transport. So big strategic transport, whereby you can get the big aircraft that you can get big numbers of tanks and equipment to another part of the country.
Do you know, I was back home in the motherland during the Easter week and I'm close to Prestwick, saw the big American planes sitting there.
The Galaxies and the Globemasters.
Indeed, they're huge things.
They're massive, yeah. And European nations have them, but they don't have anything like the numbers of them. And then tactical transport, the ability just to move people around just a few miles by air. The Americans have everything in high numbers. And when it comes to backup, the Europeans will take a decade to replicate that. So that's what they would really, really miss. No doubt about it. Without the United States, the Europeans can produce fighting forces, but they'd be far less efficient now than they would be in, say, 8 or 10 years' time if the Europeans are prepared to spend the money to replace what they would lose with the Americans.
Okay, let's just imagine a doomsday scenario. If the United States were to withdraw tomorrow, what would be the first thing that we would lose?
I think the first thing we would notice would be transport, probably, the ability to move equipment and people around. And then the second thing you would notice, and the thing that's most important, would be intelligence. Yeah. Specific battlefield intelligence as to what is going on. Again, there's a bit of it, but you could do it in the old-fashioned way. So you'd be doing it with people on the ground, you'd be doing it with overflight, with drones and so on. But whereas the Americans have got all this stuff on a day-by-day basis from their satellites, if that was lost, then that would be a considerable problem. There is also this issue that the United States, Trump might want to punish the Europeans by withdrawing certain things, but they might not withdraw that because the Pentagon knows that NATO is very much to America's advantage. The professionals in the Pentagon, they know how much NATO matters to America in all sorts of other ways that we could spend all day talking about. And I think that there'll be a big push in reality for the Americans to maintain some of the backups and then let the symbolic things, so troop withdrawals or whatever it might be, or equipment withdrawals, let those happen because ultimately they're less important than all the intelligence and logistical backup.
Some reporting suggesting that already European leaders and NATO as a specific and distinct organisation are already beginning the preparations for a life post-United States involvement, certainly at the level that it currently enjoys. What are they doing?
They're all looking at it. You're absolutely right there, Neil, that nobody's talking about it. It's not in the newspapers. But on the gossip circuit, as it were, where I hang around, I hang around the bazaars and chat and listen. And all of the MODs, all of the Ministry of Defence in the big countries are conducting exactly that exercise. Right. How do we get on if we lose everything that the Americans provide? And, of course, the answers are very sobering. So they're all thinking about it. And they were not doing that over a year ago, but they're all doing it now. And they are, as we're drawing up relatively informally, a list of all of the things that are most important that they must invest in next. And so that is happening. The other thing I should point out, President Trump makes out that all these forces are in Europe. And Europe never comes to America's aid. That's historically completely untrue. I mean, I'll give you 10 instances immediately where Europe has been there for America that he doesn't seem to understand or know about.
But so presumably not just limited to after 9/11 Article 5 of NATO.
Exactly.
I mean, we should probably explain at this juncture what happens when a member of NATO is attacked. It's basically Article 5.
Yeah. Article 5 takes place. And Article 5 has only been invoked once, which was the day after the 9/11 attacks in 2001.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
An attack on all, that's right. And George Robertson, who was then the Secretary General of NATO, he said, one of our members has been attacked.
Yeah, George Robertson, former Labour
former Labour Defence Secretary, and then Secretary General of NATO, very good Secretary General of NATO as well. And he has the distinction of being the only Secretary General of NATO to invoke Article 5. And he persuaded the North Atlantic Council the day after, said, this attack is so appalling, we must come to the aid of the United States, do everything we can to help. Now, there's only a limited amount they could do to help.
Of course.
But that was it. And, it went on in 2003, went on in 2005, went on in 2011 over Libya, 2015. When the Americans got into difficulty in Afghanistan, NATO came to try to sort it out in 2006. NATO has been there all the time for the United States, but President Trump doesn't seem to understand that. The other thing I was going to say is that when he talks about, our forces are there and we're paying for all this, they're not paying at all. It costs a lot more to station forces back in America than it does in Europe, because they're not paying for most of their bases. And the Americans in Europe, they live tax-free. Most of the families, they want to stay while their kids are still going through schools, going through the military schools. They have a very good deal. And if the United States wanted to pull out the 90,000 odd troops it has in America, it has in Europe, it would cost it a great deal more to bring them back to the United States. It's very cheap to leave them where they are, but it creates the image in the United States that they're spending all this money to defend the Europeans who never do anything for America. It's wrong on both counts.
Okay, let's talk some of the specifics then. How far away in your mind is Europe from being able to defend itself in a serious sustained conflict? I mean, which countries need to step up? I mean, I'm looking at Germany for starters.
Yeah. Well, without the United States, Europe naturally splits into a northern and a southern group. So what I call the northern toughies. So you've got the northern group, so the Scandinavian countries, all very strong, particularly on anything connected with their defence against Russia. The 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Denmark, Netherlands, Britain, Iceland, Canada. Canada is very interested in integrating itself much more into the North Europeans and leaning away from the US for reasons we can imagine. And then Germany. And Germany has done more than anyone else, rather confusedly to start with, but now with some real urgency to bring itself back to the position it ought to be in, which is the centre of European defence. So you've got that northern group of states, about 15 or so states, who look a bit like the original NATO in terms of their determination, their ability to spend, their ability to do things efficiently. France is a different case, because France is both northern and southern. France has got an Atlantic frontier, or an Atlantic coast, and a Mediterranean coast. So France is a very pivotal country, and it's got different attitudes. When you look at the other states, further south, then you're looking at the Balkans, at Italy, at the Iberian Peninsula. They've got a much more laissez-faire attitude towards NATO. They don't worry about the Russians as much as the rest of us do. They have more issues with Mediterranean security, terrorism, immigration. And so their agenda of security is different to the northern agenda. And what is happening is that NATO is naturally splitting without the Americans as a unifying factor. In fact, with the Americans as a disunifying factor. NATO is naturally splitting. European NATO is going into a northern and a southern group, which have different agendas, different priorities. And I think that, NATO won't collapse, but it will look very different, I think, in 4 or 5 years' time to the way it looks now.
What about our military and our contribution to NATO? What will the United Kingdom be doing? I mean, we're talking about preparing for conflict at a time when, again, it's being reported that the Air Force, the Navy and the Army are being asked to find £3.5 billion worth of savings.
Yeah. Well, on paper, We're going to play a different role in the future of NATO to the one we played in the past. In the past, during the Cold War, we had the British Army of the Rhine, 60,000 troops, 60,000, just in one of our armies, of the number of armies that we ran in those days, when we had 180,000 troops instead of the 70,000 that we now have. We had 60,000 of them on the Rhine, because that was treaty, that was all part of the Cold War arrangement, and we had a forward deployed air force, the RAF as a tactical air force, and we had the Navy as backup. And so the idea is Britain was on the front line in every sphere of NATO, in the Arctic, in the Mediterranean, on the Central Front, in the air. We were on the front line in every bit of NATO in those days, because we were the European leader of NATO. More than anyone else, Britain had created NATO. You know, the Americans were the driving sort of power behind it, but British diplomacy was the driving force behind the whole thing. So we took that as a matter of commitment. Now, the way we say it is that we're reserved to NATO. We don't have big forces. So the big ground forces are Poland, Germany, and Finland. Those are the big numbers in Northern Europe. And what we provide is a sort of a second echelon force, I mean, very specialised force who will go there after 30 days, maybe after 10 days, maybe after 90 days, but will go to plug a gap, go to do a job, go to retrieve a situation, difficult, dangerous stuff. But we won't be there on the front line on day one. Our army won't. Our air force will, along with the Navy, will provide a strategic backup. So we are the strategic guarantors of the North Atlantic through the Navy and for Northern Europe, air and sea. So it's a different role. Can we perform it? No.
No. Okay,
Absolutely not.
So how do we get there? And how long does it take us to get there?
Yeah.
Again, because we have occupied that position.
We have, indeed we have. And to get there is laid out in the Strategic Defence Review of last year. And we get there by 2032 to 2035. If we get on with it, but we've not got on with it.
Wait a minute, yeah, because I'm remembering we have had the Strategic Defence Review, but we haven't had the spending plans that go along with it.
The DIP, the Defence Investment Plan, which is the plan which says what the government is going to spend over the next 10 years to actually put in place all the things that the Strategic Defence Review, which they agreed with, says has got to happen.
We'd want to be getting on with it then, wouldn't we?
Yes, we've wasted the first of the 10 years. We're now wasting the second of the 10 years, which is why there's such a crisis in the politics of defence at the moment, because George Robertson and just all of the chiefs and all of the previous defence secretaries are now speaking out in unison, leaning on Downing Street to say, you're just wasting the time. The time we've got is little enough to put right the problems that we've got. And you're wasting the time because you cannot, as it were, reconcile your desire, what you say, with what the Treasury will go along with. And there's this big battle at the moment between the Ministry of Defence and the Treasury, with Downing Street sort of holding the ring. But we all know, and Keir Starmer has said, both to the Liaison Committee and to the Munich Security Conference, I was there at the conference, I heard him say it, that he will have to make decisions on spending, but he hasn't made them yet. Okay,
well, this was going to be a question about the UK, but I suppose it also applies to our European allies. If we want to get going with this, getting ourselves onto a war footing, do we have the industrial capacity, the manufacturing base, to get on with the job and get on with it? Now, if we want to get ourselves up to the levels that we would need for a NATO to survive without the United States,
in legacy terms, there's not enough of it in any of the big countries. So you look at Germany's Rheinmetall is the major defence company in Britain. It's BAE Systems. Babcock also do quite a lot. But if you're looking at our ability to build ships quickly, you can only ramp it up by 10%. You can't ramp it up by 100% or 200%. Because there aren't enough shipyards that are capable of building warships, for instance. And our lack of warships at the moment is really extraordinarily difficult and embarrassing.
100%.
The good news on all of this is that increasingly defence is also about new technologies, about small, medium enterprises, and we're very well off for inventive SMEs, an awful lot of defence innovation.
Small and medium-sized enterprises.
Absolutely, the SMEs. And they really sort of feed up from the bottom in some of the new technologies. And you look at what's happening in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have made astonishing moves in this direction. In 4 years, from having a defence that was completely open to Russian attack, they're now beginning to turn the tide, at least on the battlefield tactically, not pushing that too far, but they are beginning to turn the tide. And 90% of all of their new innovations, they develop themselves and they produce themselves. So there's some good news in here if we have the defence investment plan, which will give these companies some certainty that there's a decade of investment that they can build around.
This is where I start to get pretty worried, because deterrence is a big part of any kind of defence policy, and it depends on credibility. At the moment, does Europe have that kind of defence credibility in terms of its defence without the United States?
That's a good question. We don't know, because deterrence is a matter of perception. It's what your opponent thinks might happen. And
but if we are humming and hawing about spending what we need to spend,
it's bad for deterrence.
It's sending the wrong signal.
Of course, it is. It gives the opposition the thought that, well, maybe this is the right moment. If they get their act together in 5 years' time, then maybe this is the moment before they get their act together when we can, put a big hole in NATO solidarity. Now that the Americans are detaching themselves, this is the moment. President Putin might say to himself, "This is the moment we can really kick NATO right down the steps for a generation," which no other Russian leader has been able to do. And I and my country would feel so much safer if I could split NATO apart in Europe as well as across in transatlantic terms.
Okay, well, let's just do a wee thought experiment, considering a NATO without the United States. And one of those ways in which Russia might well tempt to defenestrate us is by something going on in the Baltics. What would that conflict look like without the United States inside NATO?
The first stage of a conflict like that you wouldn't notice the lack of the United States. It would be the next stage that would be the important thing. So, and this is, they game this out all the time. So the Russians have got some minorities in Estonia and Latvia, and they would, just like the Donbass in Ukraine, they'd use those minorities, whip them up into claiming that they were being oppressed and that their language is being oppressed and so on. And then Spetsnaz forces, Russian behind the lines forces, would come in as civilians and whip up domestic disorder. And that disorder would come to such a point that people would get killed and the police would be attacked and the police would attack civilians. And then, when the thing got so bad, then some Russian forces would cross the border to restore order in a city like Narva, for instance, in Estonia, which is where they worry about the Friendship Bridge, literally one bridge that separates Russia from Estonia. They would come across, and then that would be an Article 5 eventuality. A nation, and one of the NATO members would have been invaded, but the Russians would say this wasn't an invasion, this is just disorder, nothing to do with us. Nothing to do with us. And we've only now stepped in order to restore order for our people, for our Russian speakers. And the idea is that if they did that, the Americans wouldn't react because they were not going to go to war for Estonia, that the Europeans would be split. And in reality, Article 5 would be seen to be a paper tiger. And that's all they need to do in order to then say to all the southern European members in the Czech Republic and Hungary and Romania, look, Article 5, NATO is not going to help you. So, we are the dominant power. You better lean towards us for the future, because NATO is actually a broken reed. Just look what happened in Estonia. That sort of crisis is gamed out all the time by the NATO allies, because that's the most likely flashpoint in which Putin might try to create a crisis to fatally undermine NATO politically, while he thinks he can, with the Americans taking a back seat.
Well, given the fact that there exists the possibility the Russians could do that tomorrow, next week, end of next month, are we already too late to properly prepare NATO for a life after the United States?
No, not too late, but it's getting late. The problem with the Baltics is that it's a geographical problem. There's no reserve. That you can't. There's nowhere to fall back to. They're very small. They're very flat. You're back into the sea. So you can't actually, as it were, fall. You can't trade territory for time. Fall back, regroup, and then come and retake your territory. As the Baltics always say, we need to be defended, not liberated. And that means we've got to defend ourselves on the border. Now, one thing that has emerged, you wouldn't have said 5 years ago, is that the advent of really intensive drone technology. If the Baltics are now saying this themselves, if we had 1 million drones ready to go, that any Russian forces that actually came over the border, we could attack them with drones, and the Russians would know that they'd immediately get bogged down in the way they've been bogged down in Ukraine. That in itself might be an interesting deterrent, which is better than tanks and armoured fighting vehicles rushing through the Via Baltica across the Zvolky Gap to try to get to Estonia in time, over sort of 48 hours, while the Russians are there in 2 hours. So it's possible that thinking differently, you can create a deterrent. But that's still in the conceptual phase. The Estonians don't have 1 million drones, but it's not impossible that in 2 years' time they could.
I mean, Michael, we started this podcast with you saying, it's going to take a decade for us to get to a place where we'd be happy without the United States involvement. I mean, honestly, just strictly between you and I mean, we should be worried about the Americans pulling out, and probably should be doing everything we can to make sure they stay within the alliance.
Yeah. I think there's two ways of thinking about this, Neil. One is to say, look, we can't keep the Americans in Europe forever. There is a sort of glide path for the next 30 or 40 years whereby the United States is going to concern itself much more with the Indo-Pacific, because that's where its real objectives are going to lie, and we've got to get used to that. And the Europeans have said that for years. Yes, we're on a glide path. We've got to adjust, and they said it, but they didn't mean it well enough. What Trump has done, quite usefully in a way, is he's turned that glide path into a cliff edge. He's made it happen all at once. Now, that means the Europeans have got to now take on board all the things they thought they had a decade to worry about. They've got to worry about them now, this year. And I think it's also true that we shouldn't overemphasize the power of the MAGA Republicans. I mean, we don't know how long MAGA Republicanism will last in the US. It might not go beyond 2028, but it might go another 8 years beyond that if there's a MAGA successor to Donald Trump, which is entirely plausible. Nevertheless, the sympathy for NATO within Congress in general is really quite high. Not among the MAGA Republicans. They despise us. They just despise the Europeans on every level. But in Congress, the sympathy for the Europeans and NATO is quite high. The sympathy within the American public for NATO is remarkably high. There is, without sort of sounding complacent, we shouldn't assume that MAGA Republicanism is the long-term real America. The long-term real America values its relations with Europe, but does see that that relationship must evolve in the coming 1 or 2 generations. And I think we've got to stay focused on that while we live through this immediate crisis of dealing with this President Trump, who gets more and more quixotic as the days go by.
Now, that is your lot for today. Do remember, you can get in touch with the This Is Why team directly. why@sky.uk is the email. We've had this from Bob, all the way from Texas, about a previous episode of the podcast where we were discussing boots on the ground inside Iran. General Sir Nick Carter, the former head of the UK's armed forces, was our guest. Bob says this: as an army veteran who spent a short amount of time in both Iraq and Afghanistan, this is something I'm very interested in. Your guest provided wonderful insight, and I wish many more Americans could hear that viewpoint. Well, thanks for getting in touch, Bob. For the rest of you, why@sky.uk for your thoughts on what you've heard today, and indeed any ideas for future episodes. We're back again tomorrow.